Hey everyone, this is a quick problem on how to solve an equation that's a quadratic. The reason we know it's quadratic is because the highest exponent is a square, is a 2. And we're going to just go over how to solve this type of quadratic. Now, um, a good indicator of how you go about solving this will be found in the way that the prompt asks you to write your final answer. Remember, there's 3 ways to solve a quadratic. There's the square root method, there's a factoring method, and there's the quadratic formula. Okay. If I'm going to use the factoring method, I know that my answers are going to be rational numbers. So there'll be numbers that I can write as a fraction or a whole number somehow. But when it says that the answer should be written in simplest radical form, that's an indicator that the answer is going to have a radical in it, which means factoring isn't going to work. Okay. The other thing that I recognize is that I have an a value, a b value, and a c value, an x squared, an x, and then a non-x term, essentially. Okay. That tells me that the square root method is probably not going to be the best way to go about this. So that leaves the quadratic formula. And in order to solve the quadratic using the quadratic formula, we have to have the equation equal 0. So the first thing we want to do is move everything over to one side or the other. So I'm going to rewrite the problem here. And I want to kind of explain which side you should put it on. Now, it would be easier for me to move the 16x squared over to the right-hand side by subtracting 16x squared. And that would be fine. You get 0 equals something. The problem is the a value then becomes a negative a value. And it's not that it's wrong. It's just going to make your life more difficult towards the end of this problem. It may save time here, but it's going to add a lot more time later on. So my advice is always when you're getting it equal to 0 as the first step, make sure your a value, the term in front of the x squared, is going to end up being positive. And since this is already positive, I want to keep it where it's at, and I want to move everything else over to that side. So I'm going to subtract 16x, and I'm going to add 9 to both sides of this equation. And so writing it in standard form, I got 16x squared minus 16x plus 9 equals 0. From here, we're going to use the quadratic formula. And remember, the quadratic formula says x equals negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And so we need to identify our a, our b, and our c values in order to get my answer here. So the a value is going to be 16, according to the term, the coefficient in front of the x squared. The b value is the coefficient in front of the x, so that's going to be negative 16. And the c value is the constant at the end, so that's going to be 9. So we're just going to plug those values in. Remember, when you go to substitute, you always want to write down parentheses, so it's negative something, negative b, which is negative 16, plus or minus the square root of b squared, so that's going to be negative 16 squared, minus 4 times a, which is 16, and then times c, which is 9. And then all over 2 times 16. Okay. Now from here, to simplify this, we want to make sure that we have, we're following the order of operations. So we want to make sure that we're doing our grouping first. And we can recognize that we have 2 big groups. We have the numerator as one group and the denominator as a second group. So we want to simplify everything on the top and simplify everything on the bottom separately. Okay. And so the bottom is easy, that's 32. But the top has to be broken up into separate groups itself because we have addition sign, subtraction sign, breaking apart pieces. So inside the radical is one group, you could say, and then outside the radical would be kind of a different group. But even inside, I can break it apart by the adding and subtracting thing. So if you remember from past videos, there's 4 things that you can kind of do all together. You can deal with this first term, the negative b, put that down. So that's going to be positive 16 and plus or minus. Your second thing is this negative 16 squared. So negative 16 squared is going to be 256. That's the second thing. The third thing is to multiply these 3 numbers. This can all be done together. But check the sign. Make sure your sign is right. We have a negative times a positive times a positive. That's going to be a negative. And then 4 times 16 times 9 is going to be 576. Okay. And then the fourth thing is the denominator. 2 times 16 is 32. Okay, so we've done what we can all in one step. Now let's just keep simplifying this. So this is going to be x equals. Now we're going to simplify what's inside the radical. We're going to group the radical terms. So we have 16 plus or minus the square root of 256 minus 576 is going to be negative 320, and that's all over 32. From here, we would decide what to do, whether we're going to round the answer to the nearest hundredth or thousandth, or if we're going to write it as a radical, we're going to approach this differently. Because I want to write it as the simplest radical form, I'm going to break apart that 320. I'm going to factor that negative 320 down. And so you could use your factoring tree, or you can use your cake method. I'll go ahead and use the factoring tree this time. One thing I see very common is that we forget the negative. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out a negative 1, okay? And then I'll keep factoring the 320 till I get to my primes, essentially. I recognize that 320 is 32 times 10, and then 32 is a prime. I can break that down to 2 times 16, and 10 can be broken down to 2 times 5. The 16 can be broken down to 4 times 4, and then each of those 4s can be broken down to 2 times 2, okay? So now at the end of each branch, we have our prime factors, and we could write those all out back in our quadratic formula. So we've got x equals 16 plus or minus the square root of negative 1. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 2's. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then a 5, all over 32. Now, from here, we're going to circle our pairs. And remember, one goes out and one stays, or one disappears. So we would get x equals 16 plus or minus. We've got a 2, a 2, and a 2. 2 times 2 times 2 is 8. The negative 1, remember, turns into an I, and then a radical 5, all over 32. If you're wondering how I did this step, how I went from the square root of negative 320 all the way down to 8i rad 5, I would recommend finding one of my videos, Simplifying Radicals, or dealing with the imaginary numbers. That should help you out there. From here, we're going to look for common factors to reduce this guy. So I recognize that all three of these terms, the 2 on the top and the 1 on the bottom, are all divisible by 8. So we can divide everything by 8 here. We're going to end up with 2 plus or minus I radical 5 all over 4. Now I want to break this answer up into its two separate answers. So I'm going to write it as x equals 2 plus I radical 5 over 4 and 2 minus I radical 5 over 4. Okay. And in later classes, we will talk about how to break that, or how to make it look a little bit different so it's written as a real complex number. But that's all I was looking for here. Okay. This should help you solve number 7 on your last test, your test corrections. So if you need any help, hopefully that did it for you. If you have any questions, please comment below or find me in tutoring somewhere.